Speaker tonight is a national speaker, not just a local speaker. Let me give you a little short bio so we can get him up here. William J. Federer is a nationally known speaker, best-selling author, and president of Amerisearch Incorporated, a publishing company dedicated to researching America's noble heritage. His American Minute radio feature is broadcast daily on stations across America, and his Faith in History TV program airs daily on DirecTV via the TCT network. A former U.S. congressional candidate, Bill has appeared on C-SPAN, Fox, The Blaze, Hannity, O'Reilly Factor, NPR, MSNBC, CBN, TBN, Fox Strategy Room, and C-SPAN Book TV. He has been interviewed on Focus on the Family, G. Gordon Liddy, Michael Medved, Michael Reagan, Common Sense Radio with Ollie North, Armstrong Williams, Salem Radio Network, Bot Radio Network, and Phyllis Schlafly Live, and thousands of others. He has been quoted, referenced in federal court cases, congressional addresses, legislative hearings, USA Today, Human Events, New York Times, Washington Post, Roll Call, National Review, Harper's Magazine, WND.com, Townhall.com, Newsmax.com, Crosswalk.org, CitizensLink.com, and DailyCaller.com. His book, America's God and Country, Encyclopedia of Quotations, has sold over 500,000 copies. Other books include Change to Change, 6,000-Year Quest for Global Control, The Interesting History of Income Tax, the original 13A documentary History of Religion in America's First 13 States, and What Every American Needs to Know About the Qur'an, A History of Islam in the U.S., Miracles in American History, 32 Amazing Stories of Answered Prayers. So see, folks, we are very honored to have him tonight, and I'll bring him up now. William Federer.
Well, thank you so much, and it is a tremendous honor to be here with you. Take this so that I can hold it a little bit closer. I wanted to mention a word about a few things on the table back there. One is a DVD called Change to Change. It's a 6,000-year quest for global control. It goes all the way back to the very beginning of recorded human history, traces it century by century up to today, and guess what the most common form of government is in all of recorded history? Dictatorship. Kings, Pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser, Sultan, Czars. Power gravitates into the hands of one person, sort of like gravity pulls a satellite back down to Earth. What is rare is people experimenting and ruling themselves without a king. And you have Israel under the judges, right? That first 400 years when they came into the Promised Land. Athens tried to have a democracy for about 300 years until Alexander the Great's dad conquered them. Rome was a republic until Julius Caesar found a way to make himself dictator for life. And so all the attempts to rule without a king, the rubber band always snaps back, usually in times of internal crises and external attack. And then you have philosophers that want to speed it along. Machiavelli, Karl Marx, Saul Alinsky. And they talk about intentionally creating internal domestic crises so that people will give up their freedoms and have power concentrate. And we see that is the strategy being used by those in leadership in America. Anyway, connects a lot of dots. It's called Change to Change. It's the 8-part DVD series. And then another is called Miracles in American History. My wife has heard me speak for 30 years, and she decided to pick out the best stories. And there are times when our country was in a crisis, the French Revolution, the War of 1812, the Civil War, World War I, II, and we had leaders that called us to faith and had courage, and things turned around. And so it's a time that we need encouragement today as well as back then. And then what I'm going to be talking about tonight is the book called What Every American Needs to Know About the Qur'an, A History of Islam in the United States. And then there's 2 different DVDs. One is called Islamic Conquest, Past and Present, and it's 5 half-hour programs. And then another is called Political Islam's War on the West, and that's 8. And my wife has a little book table deal where if you buy 2 things, you get a third one free. So everything's $20, but if you buy 2 things, you get a third one free. So great for getting presents. Now, Muslims are not violent.
Really?
But some are. And it's those some that we're concerned about. 9 of the 10 worst countries persecuting Christians and Jews today are Islamic countries. And we see it coming to America. Boston bombing, Fort Hood shooting, beheadings in Oklahoma. They don't like democracy, and they're growing. They do acid attacks in Pakistan. They throw acid in young women's faces if they're not wearing the burqas. And then they have child brides. CNN reported 6-year-olds because Muhammad's youngest wife was 6 years old. They have corporal punishment where they stone people in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. They have Dira Square, Justice Square, where weekly they chop off arms and legs. And if I've talked to American soldiers that were there, and they push them up to the front because they want them to witness it. And the one soldier I talked to said, yeah, I witnessed the stoning. And they stoned the poor woman to death. And so they have, in Sharia law, cut off the hand of a thief. In America, we have an 8th Amendment that says no cruel and unusual punishment. And this is Nigeria. And Boko Haram is wiping out entire villages. They're doing this also in Syria and in the Congo. A 16-year-old girl committed suicide after a judge ordered her to marry her rapist in Morocco. Another man was a pastor, was sentenced to death for not converting to Islam. There's an international outcry on his behalf. A young girl was stoned to death in the Crimea for participating in a beauty pageant because she violated the laws of Sharia. And here, CNN reported a 14-year-old girl was raped by her 40-year-old uncle. When the local imam found out about it, she was ordered to be whipped 101 times for allowing herself to be used as a tool of Satan to tempt the man. And she died after the 70th whip. Here's an Egyptian boy sentenced to 3 years for a Facebook posting. And in Canada, an Islamic Afghan man and a polygamous wife killed a co-wife and 3 teenage daughters, accusing them of being too westernized. And then we see Kenya, mall killings by the Muslims. And then churches being destroyed even as we speak in Iraq, Iran, Egypt, Middle East, Kenya, Nigeria. I spoke to a Syrian bishop, and he said there are areas where there had been a Christian presence for 2,000 years, and now it's all wiped out. And so we see this happening right on our watch. So the grave of Jonah, remember Jonah the prophet of Nineveh? His grave existed from 700 BC up until last year, and the ISIS Muslims destroyed it. And then, this is last week, the Museum of Antiquities in Syria was destroyed by these Muslims, smashing up 900 BC. The Assyrian Empire. Here they're grinding off the face of these sculptures. Now why? Why do some Muslims persecute Christians and Jews? Why are they doing this? Well, they think they are following the example of Muhammad. And Muhammad was the best Muslim that ever lived. His life is called the Sunnah, which means the way or the example. And so we have some people saying, well, Muslims are peaceful, and then we have others that are killing people saying Allahu Akbar. And so who do we know is the real Muslim? Is it the ones that tell us that, well, Islam's peaceful and they're hijacking it? Or is it these ones that are doing the killing and they say, we're the real Muslims? Who can tell us? Well, Muhammad. Muhammad was the perfect Muslim. He's the standard of what is a good Muslim. So Muhammad's life is called the Sunnah, which means the way or the example. His life went through 3 stages. He was a religious leader, then a political leader, then a military leader. Now this is the world 20 years before Muhammad was born. This is the Roman Byzantine Empire, goes all around the Mediterranean, and it's all Christian. And this is 20 years before Muhammad was born. This was being attacked by the Persians, who were mostly Zoroastrian. And at this time, Muhammad is 40 years old, and he begins his faith in 610 AD. And so these two superpowers, the Byzantine Roman West and the Persian East, beat each other up, leave a power vacuum, and into it came Islam. So Muhammad was born in 570 AD. His father died before he was born. His mother died when he was 6. His grandfather and guardian died when he was 8. So he was taken in by an uncle, Abu Talib, who was a merchant who would take Muhammad on camel rides. He would go to different cities and hear about the different religions. The pagan religions, the Zoroastrian, Persian religions, the Jewish faith, the Christian faith. In 595 AD, he's 25 years old. He marries a wealthy widow who's 40, and he does not have to work, so he goes into caves and prays, and that's when he begins his faith in 610 AD. And so, in Arabia, they had hundreds of different pagan gods, and each town, the most popular god was the Allah for that town. And so Mecca, being a big city, the Allah for Mecca was Hubal, the moon god, and these pagans had their calendar begin with the first sight of the crescent moon over the desert. And this got incorporated into Muhammad's belief system. These pagans in Mecca had a rock that they thought had fallen from the moon. It's a glass impact rock where a meteor hit the hot desert sand and melted it. And so these pagans kissed this rock, walked around this rock, bowed to this rock 5 times a day. They did this for centuries pre-Muhammad. Muhammad kissed this rock and it got incorporated into his belief system. That's it. It got destroyed in a fire in the Middle Ages, and so they put a big silver ring around it. That rock, along with 360 other pagan gods, were in this square building called the Kaaba. And the Zoroastrians were the Persians. And the Zoroastrians believed that paradise was filled full of virgins that would fulfill all the guy's desires. And Muhammad heard this, and it got incorporated into his belief system. The Zoroastrians also believed in jinns or genies. And Muhammad decided to include that in his belief system. So in the Qur'an, it talks about genies, right? We know the stories of 101 Arabian Nights and Aladdin's lamp and so forth. And then there's a religion, Manichaeism, that combined things from different faiths. And then Muhammad could not read, which is not uncommon for that area of the world. And even the UN Development Program reported in 2011 that 30 to 40% of people in Egypt today cannot read. So the Jews and Christians were the exception. They could read. They were called people of the book. And so Muhammad could never read the Old Testament, but he heard their oral stories called Talmud and Mishnah, and some of those stories got incorporated into his belief system. And then there's the Christian faith. And even Encyclopedia Britannica stated of Muhammad, the gospel was known to him chiefly through apocryphal and heretical sources. So Muhammad thought the Trinity was the Father, Mary, and Jesus. Nobody explained to him the Holy Spirit. Apocryphal. What are apocryphal? Those are books that are not inspired, and they're not in our Bible, consequently. One apocryphal book was the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, written by someone who knew nothing of Jewish life. It's filled full of errors and inconsistencies, so much so that no scholar gives it any credence. But Muhammad heard it, and it got incorporated into his belief system. So the Infancy Gospel says Jesus spoke from the cradle, made clay birds and clapped, and they flew away, and raised a playmate from the dead. In the Qur'an, it says Jesus spoke from the cradle, made clay birds and clapped, and they flew away, and raised a playmate from the dead. There's no other place in ancient literature that these stories appear other than this Infancy Gospel that no one then or now takes serious. But Muhammad heard it, it got incorporated into his belief system with all the other things he was hearing. And in 610 AD, he goes into Mecca and he tries to make converts. He only makes 70 converts in 12 years, and he gets confrontational. And so they chase him out of town for disturbing the peace. He flees 210 miles north to a Jewish city called Medina. And the Jews are nice, they let him in, but they reject his faith. So he goes into the minority neighborhoods in Medina, and he begins to organize a little following. We're familiar with the term of organizing in the community. And he gets a following. He goes back to the Jewish leaders in Medina. He presents himself as a candidate of change, that he's a newcomer to the city politics. He can rise above their partisanship. And so the Jews make a treaty with Muhammad, and now he is a political leader in addition to being a religious leader. Then something happens. Muhammad's followers in Mecca get confrontational, argumentative, and threatening, the way some of his followers are today. They get chased out of town for disturbing the peace. They go north to Medina, and Muhammad permits them to rob the caravans headed to Mecca in retaliation for the Meccans chasing them out of town. And so where Jesus said, if they take your coat, give them your shirt, Muhammad's attitude was, if they take your house, you retaliate, take their caravan. So he gets a whole chapter of the Qur'an on how to distribute booty for robbing caravans. It's Surah 8, chapter 8. He gets a fifth of the booty. And so the Meccans send 1,000 soldiers to protect their caravan, and Muhammad with 300 defeats 1,000 at the Battle of Badra in 624 AD. And so this amazing victory, having been outnumbered 3-1, convinces Muhammad to be a military leader. And he fights in 66 battles and raids in the next 8 years before he dies. He even used the catapult when he attacked a city called Al-Taif. And when he was told the catapult was killing women and children, his response was, they are among them. They got to be killed too. So suicide bombers and ISIS killers today say it's okay to kill innocent people to advance Islam because Muhammad did at Al-Taif when he used the catapults. And since Muhammad is the perfect Muslim, Muslims that want to be like him, they want to imitate him religiously, politically, and militarily. So there's freedom for all religions in America. But Islam is not just a religion because Muhammad was not just a religious leader. He was a political and a military leader. So our effort in the West to split the religious side of Islam away from the political military side is we're trying to split Muhammad. He was all three. What authority do we have to split their prophet? He was all three. And so a mosque is a religious building, a political building, and a military building. Bowing to Mecca is a religious bowing, a political bowing, and a military pledging of allegiance to another capital. And then we see that there are two sets of verses in the Qur'an. Now the word Qur'an means recitation because it's an oral thing, because Muhammad and his original followers were illiterate, and so they would memorize these verses. And you may say, how can somebody that's illiterate memorize all these things? Well, in Arabic they had a little rhyme to them, a little beat, very similar to rap music today. So if you have a student that cannot read in school, but he can memorize all these rap songs, and so the verses that Muhammad gets when he is in Mecca are just religious verses, and they're a little more peaceful. The verses he gets in Medina are political and military, and they're more violent. And the later verses supersede the earlier verses. By way of comparison, in the Bible, we have an Old Testament with some violence, Moses and Joshua wiping out the tribes in the Promised Land. The New Testament, Jesus and the apostles did not kill anyone. And so what Christians say, WWJD, what would Jesus do? The later example is the one that is going to be tried to imitate. It's the same way in Islam, only in reverse. Their peaceful verses came first when Muhammad was in Mecca. They're called weak verses, and they're superseded by the later verses he gets in Medina. They're called strong verses. So the later verses erase and abrogate the original verses in Mecca. So we see that in the year 627 AD, the Meccans send 10,000 soldiers to stop Muhammad from robbing their caravans. Turns out Muhammad is a brilliant military leader, predominantly because he's creative, he's unconventional, he does not play by the rules of traditional Arab warfare. These pagans had 1 month off where they agreed not to fight. A gentleman's agreement, they would go on pilgrimage to Mecca and they'd worship at that square building all their different pagan gods. Muhammad gets verses instructing him to rob their caravans during this pilgrimage Ramadan month, catches them totally off guard and comes away with a lot of booty. Well, Muhammad's version of roadside bombs. When these 10,000 soldiers are marching toward Medina, Muhammad digs potholes and trenches all around the city, which rendered the superior cavalry of the Meccans useless. You cannot charge your horses and camels across a field full of potholes and trenches while you're being shot at. They'll break their legs. So it throws off the battle strategy. So Muhammad goes to some of these pagan tribes at night and he bribes them and they slip away. He goes to some of the other pagan tribes at night and he threatens them and they slip away. Sort of the Chicago politics, the bribe or the bullet. And then it gets freezing cold for a week and the rest of the Meccans lose heart and decide to bring their troops home. And it creates a power vacuum. Sort of like last year when our president declared the war in Afghanistan and Iraq was officially over and we pulled all of our troops out and we left a power vacuum. Did they all become peaceful after that? No, they were emboldened. And in Muhammad's case, when the Meccans withdrew their troops, he was emboldened. He goes back into the Jewish city of Medina. And one Jewish tribe, he confiscates their property and chases them out of town. The second Jewish tribe, he confiscates their property and chases them out of town. Now this set a precedent in Islam called hudna, H-U-D-N-A, hudna. It means when you're weak, you make treaties until you get strong enough to disregard them. So when he first came to Medina, he was a religious refugee. He organized in the community and he went to the Jews. They made a treaty with him. Now it's 5 years later. He just chased away anybody that could rescue the Jews. He's in the position of strength. He breaks the treaty, confiscates their property, chases them out. Now, the third Jewish tribe in Medina, Muhammad bottles them in their neighborhood for 25 days. When they finally surrender, he brings them into the market and he chops off their heads. 600 or 700 of them, and then he sells the women and children into slavery. And so we see, within 5 years of Muhammad immigrating to the Jewish city of Medina, there is not a Jew left in the city of Medina. They've been chased out, killed, or enslaved. And within 5 years of Muhammad's death, his rightly guided caliphs eliminated every pre-existing culture in Arabia. Yemen down there used to be a Jewish kingdom. There were Gassanids, were Arab Christians, and all the pagans, their religions were gone. And so we see, like Caesar's 3 steps, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. Muhammad's was immigrate, increase, eliminate. Immigrate into a community as a religious refugee. Increase the number of your followers amongst the disadvantaged minorities and get involved politically, wanting to be accommodated. And then eliminate the previous culture, street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood, city by city, until you've taken it over and declared that it's part of the Islamic world. And this process is happening in Europe and in America. I was speaking in Dearborn, Michigan, and afterwards, at my book table, a lady had a ministry to pregnant moms. And so she went to the house of a Muslim woman who was pregnant, brought her a little present, and out of a bedroom comes another pregnant Muslim mom. And out of a bedroom comes another pregnant Muslim mom. And out of a bedroom comes another pregnant Muslim mom, all pregnant by the same man. He's practicing Sharia law in his house. And then someone else comes to my book table and says, oh, Foslo bought a house, a bunch of houses on the street, put a wife in each one, has them go down to the welfare office and say their husband's not around, and they get welfare checks, and he goes and impregnates them, and the more kids they have, the bigger the checks they get, and he's living like a king, and all the kids playing in the street are his children. And then they take over a couple streets, and then they vote in the school board, and so they have Sharia law in the public schools in Dearborn, Michigan, and they have their calls to prayer, and the girls wearing the burqas, and they have to be at the back of the gymnasium when they pray, because if a dog, a donkey, or a woman passes between a Muslim man and Mecca, their prayers are invalidated. And then they vote in the police department, the fire department, the school, and then they now have the loudspeakers in Dearborn where they broadcast the calls to prayer. And guess what? The non-Muslims are moving out. And then we see instances where those that refuse to move out, that's when violence takes place, and there's no witnesses. There's random violence, so a woman is raped, her house is destroyed, and no Muslim dare testify against another Muslim on behalf of a kafir infidel. If they do, they'll get in trouble. And so what happens is, eventually, all the non-Muslims move out, and they've taken over. And so it's a predictable pattern. Whenever they build a mosque, the property values surrounding it begin to go down. The demographics change, and within a few years, the majority of the population around that mosque ends up being Muslim. It's predictable. And so we see there's a 1,400-year track record to observe this trend. Now we hear the term Arab Spring. There's actually been 3 springs in the 1,400 years of Islam. The first Arab-Persian spring went from 622 to 1071. The second is a Turkish spring that goes from 1071 to 1923. And the third Arab Spring started in 1928, and that's what we're facing today. The first one would not have happened without this little invention called what? Stirrup for riding horses. It originated with the Mongolian nomads over by China. And they had little short horses, would tie a rope around the horse and leave 2 loops hanging for their big toes because they would ride barefoot. It would help them keep balance. But they would raid into China, and so the Chinese learned how to make a stirrup a little bit bigger for your foot. That invention made its way across the Gobi Desert, the China Silk Road, to Persia. And the Persians made them out of metal, leather straps, and the Muslims got them from the Persians. And so they had this new technology that transformed a horse from a transportation vehicle into a weapon. And then they got the scimitar sword from Damascus, made of Damascus steel. And it was very, very sharp and very, very light and flexible. So you literally could hold the reins of the horse in one hand and the scimitar sword in the other hand, and at a full gallop, they could slice them one in half. And so we see this explosion of Islam. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court chamber in Washington, D.C. has lawgivers engraved around the ceiling. It does have Moses and his 10 Hebrew commandments. It does have Charlemagne and John Marshall and Muhammad with his Arabic crown and his scimitar sword. And this is his sword. It still exists in Istanbul, Turkey, in a mosque museum. And we see this explosion of Islam. One of Muhammad's generals is Khalid ibn al-Walid. He was undefeated in over 100 battles, and he defeated the apostate Muslims. After Muhammad died, a bunch of Muslims wanted to leave, and he had the Ridda Wars, where you kill them because you won't let them leave. And then he defeats Persians and Byzantine armies. And then they defeat Syria. Did you know that Syria was the first country to completely be Christian, evangelized by the Apostle Paul? In Antioch, Syria is where the name Christian was first used. And there's more ancient Christian writing in the Syrian language of Syriac than any other language other than Greek and Latin. And these Syrian Christians evangelized east like the Greeks did west. So they evangelized into India and Persia and Central Asia, Mongolia, even China. During the Tang Dynasty, had a thriving Syrian Christian community that lasted all the way through the Yuan Dynasty. Finally chased out by the Ming, and then a Muslim leader named Tamerlane, or Timur, who killed 17 million people, wipes out Christianity in Central Asia. But Syria used to be Christian. And then, within 23 years of Muhammad's death, his rightly guided caliphs conquered Yemen, conquered Jerusalem, which had been a Byzantine Christian city since Constantine, conquered Syria, conquered Indo-Armenia, conquered Egypt. Egypt was evangelized by Mark, who wrote the Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and it was Christian for 6 centuries. And there used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa, and they were all wiped out by the Muslims. Then in the year 711, they invaded Spain. This was the largest political military empire in the world. Now, when they conquered Egypt, suddenly there was a ending of the trade. So the Roman Empire traded from east to west. And suddenly, in just 23 years of Muhammad's death, all of the Middle East is gone, all of North Africa is gone. Sort of like today, if suddenly China no longer shipped any goods to America, what would happen to our economy? All the Walmart shelves would be empty, right? And so when the Muslims conquered, Europe was brought to its knees economically. And one of the things that was held off from trade was papyrus. These were reeds that grew along the Nile, and they dried them out, glued them together, and made paper. So when the Muslims conquered Egypt, there was a paper shortage in Europe. And the Europeans began to write on more expensive things like vellum or sheepskin, and gradually literacy declined, and they wrote fewer books, and we call this the Dark Ages. So Islam is largely responsible for Europe entering the Dark Ages. And this is they conquered from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean. In the year 711, 80,000 Muslims invaded Spain. And they were on their Arabian horses with stirrups and scimitar swords. The Europeans were still on foot. In 10 years, they conquered all of Spain, carried away thousands into slavery. And then they crossed the Pyrenees Mountains and conquered southern France. And you read the story of the Battle of Bordeaux. In one pass, the Muslim cavalry annihilated the Frankish army. So these Franks are standing in a field with their swords on foot. The Muslim cavalry is charging. Their horses have armor. They have their scimitar swords. They slice them up. They turn around for a second, go at them. They're all dead. They were establishing the Islamic State. This was the ISIS, and they were unstoppable. So Pope Gregory puts out a plea that anybody that could fight should join Charles Martel. He was the grandfather of Charlemagne. And Charles Martel gets 30,000 volunteers, and he puts them in Tours, France. Now, this is right outside of Paris, and all of his men are on foot, and he decides to put them into a square on top of a hill. And so the Muslim army charging from downhill, looking up, it looked like a line, so they were used to just charging through and coming out the other side. Well, they charged in and got stuck. Meanwhile, Charles Martel had arranged for some of his men to sneak into the Muslim camp and free the captives. You see, they fought for religion, but they also fought for plunder. You could come away from battle with 4 wives, plus as many extra women as your right hand possesses. They just don't have the status of a wife. They're slave wives and concubines and so forth. Of course, the Sultan got a 5th. That was Muhammad's portion. Many sultans had 1,000 wives. Anyway, as the warriors saw their captives being let go, they would leave the fighting to go back, and the Muslim commander Abdurrahman tries to rally the soldiers back, and he gets distracted and killed. And now the Muslim warriors cannot decide who their next commander is going to be, and so they pick up and go back to Spain. That was the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, exactly 100 years after the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. They went from Arabia to Paris in a military campaign. And had Charles Martel not stopped them, we would be speaking Arabic right now, because German, French, and English would have never developed as languages. We would be like Egypt, where they actually cut out the tongues of anybody caught speaking the Coptic language. They eradicated the Egyptian Coptic language. And so Charles Martel got every horse he could find, and 5 years later, he won his first battle, and it took 700 years of battles to drive the Muslims out of Spain. And so we have some definitions. The word Islam means submission to the will of Allah. A Muslim is one who has submitted to the will of Allah, and Islam believes there will be world peace when the whole world submits to the will of Allah. So Islam is a religion of peace. It's just they have a different definition of the word peace. Our definition of peace is different groups getting along. Their definition of the word peace is world Islam. So when they say they're a religion of peace, yeah, that's their goal, is to have the whole entire world become Muslim. That's their definition of peace, when the whole world submits to the will of Allah. Abraham Lincoln said, we all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing. We all want peace, but in using the same word, we don't mean the same thing. Now, in Islam, the world is divided into two halves. The half that has submitted to Allah, it's called the Dar al-Islam, or the house of submission. And the other is called the house of war, the Dar al-Harb. It's the rest of the world that's in the process of submitting. And so the non-Muslim world is supposed to be at war because it's transitioning to submitting to Allah. So they see the world as Muslim and going to be Muslim. Now, what about moderate Muslims? Most Muslims are moderate. Moderate Muslims believe the world will submit to Allah later. Maybe it's the end of the world. Maybe it's even figurative. And since it's so far off in the distant future, they have no problem living in a free democratic society and having you as a kafir infidel as a neighbor. They really don't, it doesn't occupy their everyday thought. The fundamental Muslim, on the other hand, they think the world is supposed to submit to Allah now, and they want to help make it happen. Now, the dilemma for us in the West is the more we bend over backwards in unprecedented ways to show ourselves tolerant, the more the moderate Muslim begins to rethink and says, wait a second, this has never happened before. Maybe the world is, in fact, submitting to Allah now rather than later. And so they gravitate from the future peaceful moderate camp into the fundamental now camp, which is the violent camp. So all of our efforts to show ourselves really, really, really tolerant is actually creating more violence. Sort of like the law of the jungle, right? If a lion's chasing a zebra and the zebra shows weakness and is stumbling, does the lion pause and let him get on his feet again? Or does he put it? And so even just a month or two ago, I was with Kamal Salim, a former terrorist that came to America to set up Muslim training camps, and he converted to Christianity. It's a miracle testimony. But he says, in Islam, when your enemy shows weakness, they consider that Allah giving you to them. And anyway, so another word that has need of definition is the word innocent. So when Muslims were killed in France, our president gave a speech and says, well, you know, in Islam it says it's wrong to kill the innocent. Yes, but definitions in Islam, if you reject Allah, you are guilty. And so it says, Allah loveth not those who reject the faith. Be ruthless to the infidels. Make war on the infidels. Fight those who believe not in Allah. Kill the disbeliever. And so if you are a non-Muslim, you are guilty, and then it's okay for them to kill the guilty. You're only innocent if you're a Muslim. Right? So the definitions are important. Now, Spain. It took 700 years to drive the Muslims out. One of the leaders for the Spanish was Rodrigo Diaz, known as El Cid. And he was wounded in a battle, and they needed one more charge to win. And they told him, you're not going to survive. So he says, okay, tell you what, strap my body to the horse, put a board up my back, tie me on real tight. And they open the barn doors, and they slap the horse, and he goes off riding to charge against the Muslims. And the other soldiers say, hey, there goes El Cid. They jump on their horses, and they go out, and they charge, and they win. After the victory, they're celebrating, and they go, where's El Cid? He's over there all by himself, sort of, you know, just drooping off his horse dead. It's one of those romantic chick flicks, you know, you gotta rent, snuggle up on the couch, and so forth. Anyway, so again, the Muslims are being driven out of Spain. Finally, they do in 1492 with Ferdinand and Isabel. But while they are in Spain and Portugal, they enslave millions. And there were entire Catholic orders in Europe, and they were called the Trinitarians, and the head of the order was called the ransomer, and they would collect alms and donations and go under a white flag to North Africa to get your friend back. And they also enslaved an estimated 180 million Africans. Muhammad was a white Arab. There are hadiths that talk about when he lifted his arms to pray, they'd see the whiteness of his armpits, and somebody was on a donkey going to early morning prayer and rubbed up against him. He said, I saw the whiteness of the prophet's thigh. And Muhammad owned African slaves. And they had slavery for 8 centuries before America was ever discovered. And they would, the elderly and young would not survive the forced marches to the slave markets. And then finally, when the Spaniards claimed all the New World, enslaved the Native Americans for 100 years, and a Spanish priest named Bartolomé de las Casas finally got the King of Spain to outlaw the enslavement of Native Americans. And no sooner did they finish celebrating than they said, well, where can we get more slaves? Africa. And so that's when they began to buy them from the Muslim slave markets and bring them to America. But virtually every African brought to America was purchased at a Muslim slave market. And it even went on through the 1800s. David Livingstone, right? Dr. Livingstone, I presume. Remember that, the Scottish missionary to the Congo? He writes in his journal about being in the jungle in the Congo and stumbling across 1,000 Africans tied together, being forced to march single file 500 miles to the coast to be sold into Muslim slavery. And if they walked too slow, the Muslim Arab slave trader would stab them or nail them to a tree or shoot them. And he said you could see where the trails were by looking for the vulture circling. And he says one area of Africa he went through, and later he goes back through, and the whole place had been depopulated because the Muslim Arab slave traders took him. Somebody gave David Livingstone a paddle boat to go up the rivers and Lake Malawi. And he says it kept breaking because it would hit the dead bodies of the Africans that the Muslims would throw into the river. And it still goes on today. There's actually more slavery today than at any other time in world history, and a whole lot of it is in Muslim countries. Niger, Mauritania, Sudan. They call it forced marriages and sex trafficking. And they can't get rid of it because Muhammad owned slaves, and he's the perfect Muslim. So there has never been an abolitionist movement in Islam. There's never been an Abraham Lincoln. There's never been a war to free the slaves, right? And so they then attacked Constantinople. Now, it was the capital of the world for 1,000 years. When Rome fell in 476 AD, Constantine had moved the capital of the Roman Empire to where the Black Sea empties into the Mediterranean. And the Muslims tried attacking 5 times between 678 and 717, but they were stopped because the Greek-Roman defenders had something called Greek fire. This is where they took oil and sawdust, mixed it in these brass containers, sprayed it on these hot oil cannons, and the Muslims, it's like napalm, and the Muslims were turned back. Now, you could say, well, Bill, you've talked about Muslims killing people. Didn't Christians kill people too during the Crusades? What about the Crusades? The president gave a speech and says, well, Christians need to get off our high horse because, the Crusades kill people. Well, I'm glad you brought that up. Let's talk about the Crusades. Now, before I do, we could say, well, there's some that Christians kill people and Muslims kill people. Every religion has those crazy people that kill people. So it's sort of a wash. Well, that's one way of looking at it. Another way is to look at the founders. And so the largest religion in the world is Christianity. About 32% of the world identifies itself as some denomination of Christian. The second largest religion in the world is Islam, about 22, 23%. And then unaffiliated, 16, Hindus 15, Buddhists 7.1, down to 0.2 Jewish. So let's compare the founders of the 2 largest religions in the world. Jesus never killed anyone. Muhammad killed an estimated 3,000 people, including cutting off the heads of the 700 Jews in Medina. Jesus never led armies. Muhammad led armies. He fought in 66 battles. Jesus never owned slaves. Muhammad got 1/5 of the slaves taken in battle. Jesus never married. Muhammad had anywhere from 11 to 22 wives. The youngest wife, Aisha, was 6 years old. Jesus never tortured anyone. When Muhammad conquered Khaybar, which was the last Jewish settlement in Arabia, The Jewish chief refused to tell where the tribe's treasure was hidden. Muhammad had him stretched out on the ground, and they kindled a fire on his chest. Jesus did not lie. Muhammad permitted lying. It's called taqiyya, sacred lying, holy deceit. And so, a story, there was a chieftain planning on attacking Muhammad. And he asked his warriors, who will rid me of the chieftain? His one warrior said, I will if you permit me to lie. Muhammad said, go. So the warrior goes to the chieftain and says, I've left Muhammad, he's a heretic, I want to help you, but they're after me. And the chieftain says, okay, you can spend the night in my tent, the whole army will be around you, and you'll be safe. Well, in the middle of the night, the chieftain is asleep. This warrior tiptoes over and beheads him. Grabs his head, runs all the way to Muhammad, and says, Allah's face is shown upon you, O Prophet. And Muhammad said, oh no, Allah's face is shown upon you, and he gives him his staff. And says, you can lean on this in the day of judgment, because on that day, many people won't have anything to lean upon. Muhammad approved of lying, deceit, murder, to commit a terrorist attack right in the middle of your enemy's military base, sort of like Fort Hood. And another story is there was a warrior of Muhammad's who was captured and forced to renounce Muhammad. He later escaped and went back to Muhammad. And Muhammad forgave him. And Muhammad said, if they make you turn, turn, but don't turn in your heart. In other words, it's okay to deny Muhammad in a pinch to save your skin, as long as you don't fight against Islam. In other words, it's okay to say you're not a Muslim in order to get elected. But then everything you do once you're elected is to help advance Islam. Anyway, is this interesting?
Yes.
So Jesus never forced anyone to follow him, said something difficult. Many disciples walked with him no more. Muhammad said, whoever changes his Islamic religion, kill him. So you're free to join, you just can't leave. So like Hotel California. Jesus forgave insults. Muhammad avenged insults. A guy named Ibn Khattal had made up poems making fun of Muhammad, had two slave girls reciting him. Muhammad ordered him murdered. Jesus did not permit his disciples to rape anyone. Duh. Muhammad did, and there's always a decent talk about how to do it. None of the apostles were governors or generals. Every one of the caliphs and sultans were governors and generals. Jesus taught God was our Father. In Islam, it's blasphemy to call Allah your Father. Jesus taught we're children of God. In Islam, it's blasphemy to call yourself a child of Allah, because Allah took no wife and has no son. Jesus taught that we're made in the image of God. In Islam, Allah has no image. Jesus taught to have a personal relationship with God. In Islam, it's blasphemy to even want to have a personal relationship with Allah. For the first 3 centuries of Christianity, there are 10 major persecutions. Christians are thrown to the lions. The first 3 centuries of Islam, they conquered from Arabia to Paris. Anyway, here's a little thought for you. Al-Taqiyya, sacred lying. If someone's capable of cutting your head off, would they be willing to lie to you first to gain the advantage? Now, the most popular Greek Orthodox saint was St. Nicholas, and I wrote a whole book on him. But when the Muslims attacked, they were going to destroy his grave, like they did to the grave of Jonah. And so in 1087, they moved the bones of St. Nicholas, this Greek Orthodox saint, all the way from Myra to a little town called Bari, Italy. And the church is dedicated by Pope Urban II. Now, Pope names may not mean much to you, but this Pope Urban II had so many of these Greek Christians fleeing that he went to the Consul of Clermont and begged the leaders of Europe to set aside their differences and come to the aid of these Greeks, and they did, and it's called the First Crusade. And there's 9 major crusades in 200 years. By the way, all 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation in the Bible, the last book in the Bible, they were all wiped out by the Muslims. Ephesus, Colossae, Galatia. And so the First Crusade takes back Jerusalem for 100 years, and the rest of them sort of fizzle. But Richard the Lionheart led the Third Crusade, left his brother King John in charge of England. You know, the Sherwood Forest and who? Robin Hood story. And my wife and I are from a city named after the guy who led the 7th and 8th Crusades, St. Louis. He was the King of France, King Louis IX. He led the 7th and 8th Crusades. And when the Crusades ended, the Muslims pick up where they left off and they invaded Europe again. Now, the Crusades saved Europe. Why? Well, the Europeans saw themselves as little kingdoms. And when the ones on the frontier would be attacked, the other ones would sort of stand back and let them get attacked. And then they would move closer and closer, right? And the Muslims, if they had been able to invade Europe 2 centuries earlier, they would have conquered it as easily as they conquered Syria, Egypt, North Africa, and Spain. But the Crusades put the Muslims on the defensive for 2 centuries, and it caused the Europeans to sort of unite. Like the 13 colonies in America were very independent, but because of the war with King George, they had to unite. And we saw the bigger picture that we're the United States. And so the Crusades caused these European kingdoms to see the bigger picture, and they saw themselves as Europe, as Christendom, right? So the Crusades basically created the concept of Europe, and they were able to. And now when the Muslims did resume their invasion of Europe, they almost won several times. Had they been able to do it 2 centuries earlier, they most certainly would have. So if somebody criticizes the Crusades, they don't like diversity. Because wherever Islam conquers, all previous cultures are erased. And like the Coptic languages are erased, and the artwork, the Museum of Antiquities in Assyria are erased. So, in the year 1300, they control Spain, North Africa, the Madagascar, Zanzibar coast, Indonesia, northern India, Mughal, Central Asia, Tamerlane, and then the Middle East, and then Kosovo, Serbia. They invaded, they attacked Serbia 3 different times. Don't have time for a bunch of stories. There's the Vlad II was the Romanian king, and when the Muslims were invading Romania, they were demanding 500 boys a year to put into their Muslim pederasty, their homosexual culture. And the Romanian king, Vlad III, said no more. And when he caught a bunch of Muslims, he impaled them. And so when the 100,000-man Muslim army was marching into Romania, they lost heart. So his idea was to out-terrorize the terrorists. And it actually worked. And Vlad III, Vlad the Impaler, is a hero in Romania for stopping the Muslim invasion. He didn't drink blood. That was something made up by the fiction writer. In 1450, the Ottoman Muslims had crossed the Bosphorus. This little purple is what's left of that great Byzantine Empire. And then you have these green and brown, those are Venetian and Genoan merchant states who are selling military goods to the Muslims for a buck, knowing that the Muslims are going to use them against the Christian defenders of Constantinople, but they don't care. So you have this dynamic where financial interests in the West will betray the West to Islam for money. Maybe doing business with the Saudis, or maybe selling a television network to Al Jazeera, who knows. But anyway, so Mehmed II sends his navy over, sends his army over to attack Constantinople. What's that thing? He took the church bells from the Greek Orthodox churches, melted it into the largest cannons in the world, right? Sort of like Iran, what's the largest cannons in the world, but instead of gunpowder, it's nuclear power. And then he finally conquers Constantinople, and it cuts off the land trade routes to get from Europe to India and China. And so when they were, this was the largest church in Christendom for 1,000 years, and the Muslims covered it with whitewash and Qur'an verses. And so, 1st and 2nd century, Romans traded with the Han Dynasty in China. And then even Marco Polo in 1271 goes from Venice, Italy to China, works for Kublai Khan, brings back spaghetti, charcoal, gunpowder, talks about the Chinese inventing paper currency and thread from worms, silkworms, and the Chinese having plates made out of China. And of course, India had teas, dyes, and spices. So the Europeans wanted to trade with India and China. But when the Muslims attacked Constantinople and cut off the land routes, that's when Columbus set sail looking for a sea route. Columbus thought he made it to India, so he names the people the Indians, thinking that we never would have named Native Americans Indians if it was not for the Islamic State, if it was not for ISIS, if it was not for the Muslim jihadists cutting off the land routes to India and China. Anyway, as they were invading into Greece and Turkey, the Greek scholars fled west to Florence, Italy, and they brought their Greek art, architecture, literature, and this re-interest in Greek stuff we call the Renaissance. So Islam's responsible for the Renaissance, right? And the Greek scholars fled with their Greek scriptures, and this led the scholars in Western Europe to translate the Bible not just to Latin, but all the way to Greek. It laid the foundation for the Reformation. And so in 1517, Martin Luther starts the Reformation. In 1529, 100,000 Muslims surround Vienna, Austria, under Suleiman the Magnificent. The Crusades just fought 2 centuries, but they picked up where they left off, and they invaded their surrounding Vienna. Martin Luther says, the Turk is the rod of the wrath of the Lord our God. If the Turk's God, the devil, is not beaten first, there is reason to fear the Turk will not be so easy to beat. The fight against the Turk must begin with repentance. We must reform our lives, or we shall fight in vain. Our sins and our ingratitude have earned God's wrath and disfavor, so he justly gives us into the hands of the devil and the Turk. John Calvin, I hear the sad condition of your Germany. The Turk again prepares to wage war with a larger force. Who will stand up to oppose his marching throughout the land at his mere will and pleasure? John Wesley, ever since the religion of Islam appeared in the world, the espousers of it have been as wolves and tigers to all other nations, rending and tearing all that fell into their merciless paws. Even Thomas Aquinas, 2 centuries before the Reformation, said Muhammad seduced the people by promises of carnal pleasure. Those who believe in him were brutal men, desert wanderers, through whose numbers Muhammad forced others to become his followers by the violence of his arms. And finally, they were stopped by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V of Spain. And he had a double dilemma on his hand, Protestant Reformation on one hand, Muslim invasion on the other hand, so he decided to strike a deal with the Protestants. And this let the kings decide what they wanted to believe in their kingdoms, and so Europe began to split up into all these different denominations. And the pilgrims set sail for the New World. The Muslims had a pirate admiral named Dragut Reis, and he invades Spain, Sicily, Corsica, Sardinia. Do you know the Muslims invaded Rome, Italy in 846 AD? And they trashed the Basilica of St. Peter's and the bones of St. Peter and St. Paul. And the best the Italians could do was Andrea Doria. He at least put up a fight. In 1571, the largest battle on the Mediterranean, the Battle of Lepanto, 230 Muslim ships, powered by 15,000 Christian slaves under the deck, rowing like Ben-Hur. And 15 minutes before the battle, the wind changes directions to favor the Holy League. This is the Austrians and the Venetians and the Spaniards, and they finally win August 7th, 1571. And then in 1565, 40,000 Muslims surround the little island of Malta, and this is strategic because it controls the east-west traffic across the Mediterranean. Only 1,000 defenders, the Knights of Malta, led by the 70-year-old Jean Lavalette. And he tells his young soldiers, you vowed to give your life when you joined this order of the Knights of Malta. Guess what? You're going to have to give it here. And because you're probably not going to get reinforcements. And they fight courageously, courageously. It's a great story. It's all in the book and the DVDs that are on the back table there. But finally, the Muslim leader, Dragut Reis, is killed, and the Muslims sail away on September 11th, 1565. They go back to Constantinople, and the Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, is furious. And he vows he's going to just conquer all Europe. He dies the next year. His son, Salim the Drunkard, takes over, and he wants to spend all his time in the harems. Anyway, and then in 1697, 100,000 Muslims invade Serbia and Hungary at the Battle of Zenta, Z-E-N-T-A, and the Hungarians and Serbs rally. They kill 30,000 Muslims. Only 500 of the Serbs and Hungarians died. I mean, it's just a great defeat of the Muslims on September 11th, 1697. And then in 1683, 200,000 Muslims surround Vienna. And the Polish king, Jan Sobieski, comes to Vienna's rescue on September 11th. He has the largest cavalry charge in world history up to this date. 40,000 of these big Polish hussar horses. And the soldiers had made wings for their back, right, to look tough. And the whole hillside slid down. These wings flapped and made this thunderous noise across the valley. The Muslims dropped their weapons and flee. And Jan Sobieski goes into, he's called the savior of Western civilization. He goes into the abandoned Muslim tents, and he finds these bags of beans, coffee beans, and realizes this was this new Muslim drink that allowed him to fight day and night. And shortly thereafter, this Polish general, George Franz Blaszczowski, opens the first Vienna coffee house. Now, they weren't sure if they should drink coffee because it was the Muslims' drink. So they took a cup of it to Pope Clement. He tasted it, said, this is too good to leave for the Muslims. Let's baptize it. And coffee spread across Europe. Now, the word coffee comes from the Arabic word kafir, which means infidel. Because the beans came from Ethiopia, which was a Christian country. So the Muslims called the Christians infidels or kafirs. So this was the kafir bean. So have you had your cup of infidel today? Yes. But it's okay. Pope Clement said so. Now, the bakers in Vienna were up early cooking bread because they were rationing, and they heard noise under the ground. The Muslims were tunneling under the walls of Vienna, setting explosives, and they were going to blow up the wall. And so the soldiers put out buckets of water. They saw